Now, if we move to the next slide, we can see that it's in an analogous sort of situation. We have older workers have more lost time due to injury, more lost time away from work due to injury. So this has implications not only for workers' compensation, but also disability insurance and even health care insurance. So paying particular attention to workplace safety is going to be absolutely critical. If you move to the next slide, we can see that this concern is not restricted to the workplace. It is also an issue that we face on a global scale when it comes to drivers. If the average worker is getting older, the average driver is getting older. And we can see that one of the mega trends that is definitely going to be with us in the 2010s is a higher proportion of older drivers. And what we see here is that what we have here is the crash rate per 100,000 miles driven. You do see that it increases sharply for the more senior drivers, 75 plus. What I've not shown here is the death rate associated with senior drivers. The most senior of drivers have a death rate approximately equal to that of teenagers. So that is always, teenage driving safety has always been a major concern, and so as the number of seniors increase who are driving, this will be just as much of a concern. So if we, so one last point, if we go on to, I would like to make one last point on this, is that this is not just confined to workers' compensation and auto insurance. And I might, just by way of adding, that if you add the premiums written from auto insurance in the U.S. and workers' compensation in the U.S., that is equal to 42% of all premiums written in the United States. So these two factors alone are extremely important to the industry. When you add to that, you'll have commercial auto issues, in other words, older drivers who are driving for business, where these same issues will arise. It also remains a concern. If we move out into the area of liability, what we're beginning to see is an increased number of discrimination suits in the workplace related to age discrimination. Now, some of that is exacerbated by the current economic downturn and 10% unemployment rates here, but that is a major, potentially major issue as well. So the aging of the baby boomers, both here and, of course, in Western Europe, is a major trend. And with that, to talk about another dimension of that, I'd like to turn it over to Jay.
Yes, thank you. I know many of you are probably focused more on the P&C side, but I think it would be remiss not to touch briefly on the implications for life and asset management. And if you look at the top left-hand corner here, obviously it says that people are getting older. Okay, that's no surprise. I think perhaps more interesting is the graph underneath, which shows that the wealth distribution is highly uneven, with the majority obviously being held by the most wealthy of individuals. These demographic shifts lead to new product solutions and new markets. And what I would say is that this will have tremendous implications for the life business and for the asset management businesses. You may have noticed in the last couple of weeks, the White House and Mr. Obama have started to talk about the difference and the need for Americans to develop a retirement plan and income, and not just in terms of a pot of wealth such as in a 401k, but in terms of a stream of income. And obviously this has interesting implications for asset managers, but also for annuity writers. In terms of the magnitude of the problem and the concern that one has in the aging population in the United States, a study done last year highlighted that just under 50% of Americans 55 and older hold less than $50,000 in retirement assets. That's excluding their house and their defined benefit plans. But one can reflect on the implications of the financial crisis when many people's home equity has been substantially eroded, as well as with the tremendous shift from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans. So aging population, but even more so access to retirement funds will become, perhaps after the healthcare debate, the next debate that we might see on the horizon. If we turn to the next slide, sort of as Allianz thinks about how best to serve our U.S. customers' retirement needs, we sort of think about this in three pillars. We think of it in terms of asset management. We own the largest fixed income asset manager in the form of PIMCO. We think of this also in terms of Allianz Life, that basically not only looks at holding assets, but providing a stream of income, a lifetime stream of income for its clients. And lastly, in terms of old age services, where in particular in Europe, and we see opportunities as well in the U.S., that our insureds will require, for example, assistance once they come out of a hospital if they're elderly individuals and don't have children that are nearby. So we think these three pillars, asset management, guarantees of streams of income, and old age services are key components of what will be required in the future with respect to an aging population. And with that, Bob, I think you wanted to provide a couple of summary comments and then look forward afterwards to questions and answers.
Right. Thank you very much, Jay. And yes, these were four megatrends that we've identified for the decade ahead. No doubt there are others. And some of them perhaps we can foresee. Some of them, of course, are absolutely unforeseeable. What I can say is that this industry is one that has been around for hundreds of years and, of course, has been through thick and thin. And this past decade was one of the thicker ones, quite frankly. So I have every faith that it will meet the challenges in the years ahead. So with that, let me turn it over to Jean Salvatore for some logistics as we are about to take some questions.
Okay, we will now open the phone lines for questions, but before asking your questions, please state your name and professional affiliation, as well as the person to whom you are addressing the question. But I'd like to begin. We just received an email from somebody who had a question for both of our presenters, and that is, what surprised you most in the past decade, and how does it affect your opinion of the decade ahead?
Jean, maybe I'll start with that one. This is Bob Hartwig. I have to admit, a decade ago, there were many things I can say today that I at least had a sense that would happen. You know, larger scale catastrophe losses, these kinds of things, innovations from technology. I think what I underestimated the most was the volatility in financial markets and in global economies. While we're all consumed with the financial crisis, which hopefully we're just passing through the tail end of right now, being perhaps the worst since the Great Depression itself, still wrestling with 10% unemployment rates, the reality was it was a very, very turbulent decade. And the decade began, if you remember, with the dot-com bubble, and which promptly burst early in the decade, creating a 3-year slide in the equity markets and pushing interest rates down in the early part of the decade to basically the lowest levels they had been in a generation. Many view that the keeping of interest rates low at that period of time then gave rise to the housing bubble, which then burst catastrophically, giving rise to a global credit crisis. And so it is really, I mentioned it was a decade of disaster in terms of natural disaster, but quite frankly, it was a decade of financial disaster. And insurers, as some of the world's largest institutional investors, have to take that kind of volatility into account and at the same time be able to offer the types of products that individuals and businesses need on a global basis. So I would say that's what surprised me most about the past decade. I would say that in planning for the decade ahead, an extraordinary amount of financial volatility is something that I do take into consideration. Maybe, Jay, if you have a few thoughts on what surprised you the most?
Yeah, I'm not saying this just because you're right, but I was going to echo the exact same remarks. I think it's the two bubbles in terms of the investment result. The dot-com bubble affecting principally the equity markets, and then the latest financial crisis affecting the bank market. But what I'd like to add is I've also been surprised pleasantly with the resiliency of the insurance industry.